Alright, so let's quickly go through each of the FILBetter settings. First off, let's take a look at the navigation section. By default, whenever you go to previous and go to next content after or before the first or last content, you're going to snap back to that content. Let's take a look. So if I'm here and I use go to next, you can see that my cursor went back. Same thing if I'm at the beginning of the session and my cursor is before the first item and I use go to previous, it actually goes to next. But that's only for the first item. Then if I use go to previous again, it stays there. Same goes at the opposite side of the session for go to next. And then the action works as intended. So if I want to toggle off that behavior, I just can simply go here for each of those. And now if I go to next after the last content, it does nothing. All right, so let's reset to default, apply settings. So the next one is move edit cursor to start of item in lane. It's off by default, which means if I have multiple lanes of content and the lanes are not vertically aligned, the edit cursor, when I go to the next or previous lane, is going to stay at the start of the content block.
Right.
As you can tell, I don't follow the item. This is not really an issue if you like the previewing system, but if you wanted to preview manually by playing the file,
Right.
then it would be much more comfortable if the cursor followed you. So that's why this option exists. And now if I toggle it on, apply settings, and do the same thing, as you can tell, the edit cursor is going to follow the item around.
Right.
Alright, so the next section is the way the time selection works whenever we go to next and go to previous. By default, it clears the time selection. So let's take a look at that. If I have time selection here and I go to previous, it clears the time selection. If I set it to recall time selection, apply settings, and I have a time selection here, the time selection stays there. Finally, if I go content time selection and apply settings, now whenever I move to previous content or next content, I have a time selection that contains all of the item. Let's take a look at the previewing section. By default, if I go to previous or next lane, I'm going to hear a preview. I can disable that behavior here. And now, if I'm here and I go to next and previous, I don't hear anything. I can always use the preview currently solo lane
Right.
to get that effect. So this is kind of convenient if you move around a lot in your session and don't want to start a lot of previewing, even though only one can play at a time, but it can be a bit annoying. Next up, the preview marker. By default, this is the name of the preview marker that's going to be created. Let's rename it test, apply settings, and now if I go to an item and create a take marker, it's now named test. Keep in mind that if you change the name of the preview marker, it's going to change what marker is going to get selected to be deleted by the script remove preview markers from selected items. For example, if I rename this FILBetter again, apply settings, and I go to my item to add a new one. Now, if I want to delete it using my script, as you can tell, only the new one has been deleted. So keep that in mind. Next up in the previewing section, we can choose the way we create preview marker. By default, we create them at the mouse cursor position, and it doesn't matter if the item is selected or not, or if it's on a specific lane or not. I can just go to my items and create them wherever I want. If I'm outside of them, I get a prompt telling me there's no content under the mouse cursor. If we go back to the settings, and I decide to create them at the edit cursor instead, by default, it's going to create marker at the priority lane position. So my edit cursor is on top of items, but only the item on the priority lane, which is the last lane by default, is going to get a new take marker created. If I want to change that behavior, I can go here and change priority lane to active lane. Apply settings. And now if I say I have my first lane activated, it's going to be on this item that the preview marker is going to go. Let's reset to default. A quick note about preview markers. There can only be one in one content lane. For example, this comp lane contains multiple items in one lane. I can only have one preview marker. You can't move them across items. So you're going to use the script again to just move it this way. Now let's take a look at the seek playback section. As a reminder, this script is the one that allows you to start a playback session that starts from the content under the edit cursor up until the end of the session. By default, if you retrigger the script midway through, you're going to interrupt the playback session and stay at that content. You can change that behavior here and select Previous, Origin, or Last. Let's take a look at Previous, apply Settings, and if I hit it, I go back to the previous one that was played. As you can guess, Origin goes back to the one you started at. I trigger it, I go back to the first one, and if I go to Last, I simply end up at the last item of the session, regardless of if I'm there yet or not. Finally, I can also decide what happens when the playback finishes. By default, the edit cursor is going to stay at the last content, but I might want it to go after the last content, at an empty spot so that I can start recording a new line. And now, when the playback finishes, the edit cursor goes 3 seconds after the last content. Let's now take a look at the recording section. You can toggle on the recording bell here. As a reminder, if you hover over question mark, you get a lot of information about some settings. Here it tells you that the recording bell is actually a metronome tick sound. And I suggested some parameters to set it to so that it's comfortable to hear. So once I enable it, I might want to go to my metronome section, right click, make sure Run Metronome during recording is enabled, and then you want 250 Hz, 100 milliseconds, and assign soft start. If you use those settings, you should hear a recording bell that sounds like this. You might have noticed that a quick tempo marker was created, but it's not disruptive. The next two settings are here to help you edit while recording. By default, when you use one of the recording scripts from FILBetter, and you move the edit cursor during recording, if you retrigger the recording, the edit cursor stays where you were. If you want the edit cursor to reset back to the recording point, you can toggle this option off. And now, when I hit record, move the edit cursor, and record again, the edit cursor moves back to the recording point. If you toggle off the second option, scroll view to edit cursor on stop, you can keep working at this on the same spot, even if you moved around in the session. So now I can start the recording, go elsewhere, maybe zoom, and if I stop the recording, I stay here. Next up, set punch in to next content when recording with context. This option is going to prevent you from starting a recording in between items whenever you use recording with context. So with that option toggled off, if I'm in between content and I hit record with context, I can keep recording in between. So with that option toggled on, I can prevent that behavior. And if I'm in between content but I want to record with context, you can notice my edit cursor is going to jump to the next content. This is because it assumes that if you're recording with context, you probably want to record one more line of the thing that you already recorded. Even with that option toggled on, you can still use record in place to stay there. The next option allows you to change the duration that content gets pushed when you record and you use push next content when recording. You should only use positive numbers, but let's try 8 seconds. If you change that value, you'll want to toggle off and on again the script that push recordings for that to take effect. So now if I start the recording, you should push everything by 8 seconds. I'd rather have a small duration, hence the default 3 seconds, because then my session isn't artificially longer than it needs to be, only by 3 seconds or so. In the lane priority section, I can customize the priority system. By default, comp lane are going to take priority. If I toggle off that settings, and I go to a spot where I have a comp lane, and use go to next, you can tell my comp lane was ignored, and instead the last lane was chosen as the priority lane. I can also say I want it to be the first lane that is prioritized. And now, if I go to my content, first lane is prioritized. And if you have multiple comp lane, you can decide if it's the topmost first comp lane or the bottommost last comp lane that is prioritized. By using various settings, you should be able to get the system that you want. The next few options allow you to change the way the select all priority content for render functions. By default, the created export track name is going to get export prefix. You can change that, let's say render, and maybe do it for a suffix. I'm going to add an underscore, apply settings, and now if I use my script to select all priority content for render, that track is named demo_render. I might not want the script to create regions automatically if I have a different way of rendering things. I can toggle that off here, but if I keep it on, I can change the way the regions are named by adding trailing zeros and leading zeros. There's a couple examples of what it looks like when you change that value. Let's take a look in the session. So I might want 1 leading zeros and 1 trailing zeros. Let's take a look. First, I'm going to delete those and export again. And now if I open my region manager and take a look, my region have the name and then 0 and then the number and then another 0. And I have 27 of them. So the last one is 27, 0. Trailing zeros are useful because you might want to add a new line in between two previously recorded ones, and you want it to be listed in the right order still. So that new line, you might say 26, 5. So it's going to be stored right in between those two in any file explorer or finder. The last option, display error messages when user selection is incorrect. This setting is going to give you prompts whenever you don't select a track and you try to do something, such as go to the next lane, select a track first, and if I have a track but it doesn't have fixed item lanes enabled on it, and I try it again, I get prompted that I don't have fixed item lanes enabled on the track. These prompts are contextual. If you'd rather have the script silently do nothing, in that case, you'll definitely want to toggle that option off. And now, I have no track selected, and I try to go to the next lane, nothing happens. I hope this video helped you if you had misunderstandings about the settings. If not, and if you still have questions, you can ask them below or directly on the Reaper forum post. Thanks, bye.